Hello team players. So I've changed the layout of these build videos quite a bit. Those of you that came from my random character generation short have an idea of what I'm talking about. But for those who don't, effectively I am rolling completely randomly to determine basically everything but feats. Will these builds be optimal? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends on what I roll. But I wanted to show you guys that you don't need to build a completely optimal build to have fun in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I believe you can play anything you want as long as you have a good team and you use teamwork and strategy. You don't need to have a 4 in your class's main stats, especially if you've got characters that have buffing and debuffing potential in your party, or at least showing that is the goal. Today's build, I've rolled a Yaksha Necromancer. Let's dive in. So Yakshas do get a penalty to intelligence, which is what our spells will go off of. But luckily for us, Necromancers are occult casters, which means we have access to a ton of buff spells that will not use our intelligence at all. We are going to be using our spell DC some in this build, actually quite a bit more than you think, which means we're going to have to rely on our other teammates to help us out with our lower intelligence. Or the other way you can do it is by taking the 2 free boosts rather than the boost that Yakshas give us. For our heritage, we rolled Respite of 1,000 Roofs, which gives us training in crafting and cooking lore. In addition, we get the improvised tool skill feats, which effectively means we can craft some basic gear even if we don't have the formulas. We do still need the raw materials though. These are all going to come in handy, but especially the crafting, which we'll see in a little bit here. For your attributes, as long as intelligence is your highest, you should be good. You also need decent dexterity. You will not need strength at all in this build. Of course, I use the actual Yaksha boosts, so my stats end up being Strength 0, Dexterity 2, Constitution 2, Intelligence 3, Wisdom 0, and Charisma 2. But as you level up, your intelligence and your dexterity are the most important stats to increase. Now we rolled Flesh Magician for our subclass, which means we get the Deadweight class feat, as well as the Toughness General feats. In addition, each time we destroy one of our thralls, it leaves behind difficult terrain. Our thralls are more than likely going to be zombies for this spell, but obviously they can be anything you want them to be. With the Deadweight Focus spell, we can have a thrall grab onto an enemy and either lower their speed, immobilize them, or grab them, depending on how they do on their saving throw. It is a Fortitude save, but they have to critically succeed to not be affected at all. And even lowering an enemy's speed is pretty big. Minus 10-foot penalty to speed on a successful saving throw is pretty darn good, especially in combinations with the other builds in this party, which, don't worry, are coming. But the best part about this is we don't even have to see our thrall to do this. We just have to have line of effect, which is pretty easy to get, actually. For our Ancestry feat at level 1, we're going to be taking Meticulous Restorer. This will give us the Quick Repair skill feat, and anytime we roll a critical failure on an attempt to repair an item, we get a failure instead. This will allow us to use a shield much more effectively in this build, as we'll eventually be able to repair our shield for 3 actions, or even 1 action if we get high enough level. Plus, you never know when you might need to repair an item quickly, especially outside of combat. And since we get automatic train in crafting, might as well take this. It's pretty great, especially with the edict that Respite of 1,000 Roofs gives you. Necrotic Bomb allows us to destroy a thrall to deal good damage in a 10-foot emanation around that thrall. We do have to be careful with this because it's all creatures in the area, including our allies. But this does really good damage and heightens well. We're going to want to be using this sparingly because a lot of times our thralls are going to be providing flanking for our allies, which means if we use this, it's going to hit them too. But if our allies aren't in a flanking position yet, and there's a bunch of enemies around one of our thralls, there you go. But this does require a basic reflex save, which means we are going to have to rely on other party members in order to lower reflex saves on the enemy, because we're not really going to be able to do it. But the main goal here is to overwhelm the enemies with our thralls and also buff our allies. Now we move on to level 4, and we're going to take Draining Strike. This is definitely a ranged Necromancer build, but we don't have to make a melee strike for this. So we can make a ranged strike, and if we hit, we can destroy up to 3 thralls near us or our target. This strike also deals 1d4 spirit damage, and we get back 1d4 hit points. But that last part doesn't matter. Remember that every time we destroy a thrall, we get difficult terrain where that thrall was, which means we can create a bunch of difficult terrain by destroying 3 thralls around our targets or ourselves, which means it's going to be hard for enemies to get away from other members of the party, and that's why we're taking this. The spirit damage and the healing is good, but not great. We want that difficult terrain though, and normally we can only destroy 1 thrall at a time. But this lets us do up to 3. For our ancestry feat, at level 5, we're going to take Stem the Tide. This gives us Protector Tree as an innate spell, and it heightens with us. It's not going to be as good as if we had the spell on our spell list, but what this does do is help us with damage against our allies and ourselves. What this also means is that if we put this next to our thralls, and the tree happens to take all the damage, that means our thralls get to stay up, even though they are automatically hit, because the tree takes the damage first. Also remember that when our thralls are destroyed, they leave behind difficult terrain, making it even harder for enemies to leave the area. At level 6 is when we'll want to take our Alchemist dedication. Remember that void damage isn't always the best type of damage to do. We may be going up against undead, or we might be going up against someone that is weak to something other than void damage. And the Alchemist dedication will give us access to Alchemist bombs, giving us a lot more versatility. If we're going up against something like trolls, then that Alchemist fire is going to help a ton. And Bottled Lightning will make the foe off guard on a hit. So even if we don't have a bunch of thralls yet that we can use to grant flanking, we can still make the foe off guard, making it easier for everyone to hit. And at level 8, we'll take Voluminous Vials to give us even more bombs per day. Remember that we just have to hit with our bombs to do damage. They don't get a saving throw, and we're not using our spell attack roll for this. Intelligence only determines how many bombs we get per day. And we're going to want to be using these bombs a lot more than our thralls, since our bombs don't go off intelligence. For our level 9 ancestry feat, we're going to go with Horn and Bone Incantation. This effectively allows us to cast animal form and humanoid form as innate spells. So if we need to be in melee combat, we can be by going into animal form. But again, this is a last resort type thing. We're not going to be needing to go into melee combat a lot, because we'll have a whole bunch of thralls protecting us. And remember, even though our thralls only have 1 hit point and are automatically hit, they still have to spend an action to get rid of them. And that's the main thing, if we don't use them for a necrotic bomb or another focus spell. Smart enemies are going to go after us, sure, but most enemies are not that smart. They're going to use their first attack on a thrall, which means any subsequent attacks are going to be at -5 or even -10. Unless, of course, they're using an agile weapon. But if we can get an enemy to waste their first attack on a thrall, that's pretty amazing. And the last feat I'm going to cover in this video is Zombie Horde. So we target a thrall and we destroy it. Then, the area in a 10-foot burst around that thrall becomes difficult terrain. In addition, all enemies in that area take 3d4 bludgeoning damage with a basic fort save. Also, when we sustain the spell, we can move it up to 10 feet. In addition, if we move this onto another thrall, we can destroy it to increase this area by another 5 feet. Remember that our special enhancement of our thralls means every time we blow up a thrall, it leaves behind difficult terrain. So, that means even if we move this difficult terrain to a different area, we're leaving behind a square of difficult terrain as well. Which means we can make this entire area difficult terrain if we want. I mean, granted, it would take a while, but we could do it. We'll talk about that when we get to the wizard bells later on. In the meantime, though, movable difficult terrain, always good. Alright, now let's talk spells. We're an occult caster, which means we have access to some very good buff spells, like Forbidding Ward and Bless. Those are the types of spells we want. Ones that don't have spell attack rolls or DCs. We still want high intelligence for our focus spells, but we're not going to be using those all that often. We mostly want to be attacking with our zombies when we can, buffing our allies, and doing elemental damage in the spells, none of which really require intelligence. We are definitely going to be wanting to use that necrotic bomb more than our other focus spells, but we don't want to rely on our intelligence too much since we are taking a penalty to it. We can have some debuff spells in this build, but as a Necromancer, we don't have a huge amount of spells. In fact, we probably have less than other spellcasters, which is kind of a big deal. So be very careful about what spells you actually prepare. If you've got free archetype, obviously you can take your alchemist dedication over there. That will allow you to take other feats in place of where I took the alchemist feats. But there are a few other archetypes that would be good for this build. Herbalist comes to mind, as that'll give you some healing options. Poisoner also comes to mind, as you'll be using the Poison's DC and not your class DC, and because your class DC will not be good, even with intelligence as your highest stat. And finally, Bard is also an effective choice for this build, as you'll be able to buff allies even more. Granted, you will need to up your charisma at that point, but you could also go Occult Witch. But Witch isn't going to have access to the amazing composition cantrips that can really help your party if you go Bard. But one of those two is going to be very effective as a free archetype for this build. Hello team players, and welcome back to another random teamwork build. This one was kind of tough for me because we rolled an ancestry that isn't exactly great in all campaigns. We of course did roll the merfolk ancestry, which means this build may or may not work for you. You basically, as a merfolk, have to sleep in an aquatic environment. That means you need to be near one at basically all times, whether that's a river or the sea or something of that nature. But if you are in a campaign where you have something like that, then I definitely recommend you check out this build. And in this build, we are going to be trying to work with our Necromancer that we rolled last time, my Flesh Bomber. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's right up here. So of course, we do need a Merfolk Heritage, and what I rolled was Abyssal. Basically, this gives us dark vision, and if we need to like scout ahead in the deep, deep ocean, we're not going to take pressure damage. Dark vision is always great, but the pressure damage thing is actually pretty niche. But in some campaigns, this may come in handy. For our attribute boosts, we do want pretty standard for a ranged runesmith. That means we're increasing our dexterity, our intelligence, and we will need a little bit of charisma in this build. Our main focus will be on our runes and our ranged attacks. But we will be taking a feat that requires intimidation, which is why we need a little bit of charisma. But we'll get into that a bit later. And of course, also at level 1, we do get our runes, which I'll talk about later in this video, and the shield block general feats, allowing us to block damage with our shields. And of course, we are a martial character, which means we do get a runesmith feat. And we're going to go with backup rune enhancement. This allows us to cast sigil as a cantrip, working like any other cantrip. But more importantly, this also allows us to cast either runic body or runic weapon once per day. We don't get both. We have to choose one or the other. But for this party, we're definitely going to want Runic Body most of the time. It is only once per day, but we can cast this on one of our Necromancer's thralls, making it that much harder for enemies to ignore that thrall. And we can also cast it on the Necromancer's actual weapon, if we want to. Assuming, of course, it's Runic Weapon and not Runic Body. This also heightens with us, which means it'll be good no matter what level we're at. Yes, our Necromancer's thralls are going to go down in one hit, regardless of their attack roll. But if they're spending an action attacking the thralls and not us, or the Necromancer, all the better. Especially since non-smart enemies are probably going to use their first attack on that thrall. And remember that Create Thrall is a one-action cantrip, which means our Necromancer can spam it. For our Ancestry feat at level 1, we'll want to take Ocean's Bite. We are a ranged Runesmith build, but that doesn't mean we're not going to get stuck in melee. And we don't want to have to switch our bow out if we want to attack in melee. So this will give us an unarmed attack that deals 1d8 piercing damage. So we will not need a melee weapon for this build. At level 2, the first thing we get is the Runic Crafter ability. This essentially means we no longer have to worry about finding fundamental runes, because we can just make them. Granted, it'll take a while because of the crafting rules, but we'll always have access to fundamental runes, which is a big deal, whether it's on armor, shield, or weapon. And of course, we do get our second class feats. And we're going to go with Runic Singer. Using performance for crafting isn't all that important. It's great, and is another reason we need our charisma to be high. But the real reason we're taking this feat is that we need a free hand to be able to craft runes during combat. And even though we are a ranged runesmith, we might not always have a free hand. Plus, this does remove the manipulate trait from the trace runes action, which means that if we do get stuck in melee, we're not going to take a reaction for tracing a rune on an enemy or an item or whatever we're tracing a rune on. This also means we can use the 2-action version of Trace a Rune for 1 action. For level 4, I've gone with Terrifying Invocation. This effectively allows us to demoralize an enemy and invoke one of our runes on them, which basically means we get to debuff them and do damage. Because this will work best with the runes that we can put on enemies that make them take extra damage. Unfortunately, this is a demoralize action, which means this is probably a once per encounter thing per enemy. For our level 5 Ancestry feat, I've gone with Healing Flesh. Effectively, this allows us to take 1 damage in order to administer first aid, treat disease, or treat wounds without healer's tools, and get a +1 on the check. And if we do happen to die, then we can effectively give one of our allies a full heal, as in all their hit points back. I mean, they do have to eat our heart and liver, but hey, we're dead anyway, right? This is kind of a last resort type thing, though, because our wisdom is not going to be all that good. But getting a +1 to heal checks on treat wounds is pretty good. But this doesn't work with battle medicine, unfortunately. Moving on to level 6, we're going to take Transpose Etching. Moving runes around is a huge deal, especially with the runes we're going to be taking. We can move them to different enemies, we can move them to different allies, etc., etc. But both targets have to be within 30 feet of you. But that's still quite a long way. So even though we are a ranged runesmith, we're going to be able to stay pretty far back and still use this. For level 8, it's Elemental Revision. At some point, your allies are going to get runes on their weapons that do elemental damage. This effectively allows us to switch those to different runes for 1 minute. Effectively meaning that if one of your allies has a corrosive rune on their weapon, but the enemy is immune to acid, we can change it to fire, cold, or electricity, so they can actually do their extra damage. But don't worry, this goes back to the way it was after 1 minute. And if you get all the way to 15th level, you can do this on the greater version of the elemental runes as well. While this is kind of niche, there are going to be situations where enemies are immune to the type of damage that your allies are doing with their runes. So we need to be able to switch those if we can. And remember, you can put these runes on hand wraps of Mighty Blows, which is going to be important for the next build in this party. At level 9, our ancestry feat is going to be Shore Gift. This effectively allows us to actually function on land, as our normal land speed is 5 feet. This gives us a land speed of 25 feet, so we can actually move around and stuff on land. And it counts as a disguise. And we can stay in this form as long as we want, and use this action again to go back to our merfolk form. I know this seems really late to have this, but it is important, as we're not really going to be able to have to help the team much until this point, which is why this is a ranged Runesmith build, because we're not going to be able to move all that much in our merfolk form on land, which is another reason why Ocean Spite is so important, as we're going to get stuck in melee quite a bit too, and we don't want to have to waste our actions switching weapons. And the last feat for this video is going to be Clashing Composite Invocation. For 2 actions, we can invoke 2 runes on a target. They have to be from opposing magic traditions though. That's 1 arcane and 1 divine, or 1 primal and 1 occult. In addition to the effects of the runes, we also force the target to make a fortitude saving throw. Depending on how well they do on their saving throw, they might be sickened 1 or even sickened 2. Which, if you don't know what sicken does, it effectively levels them down, just like frighten does. But they have to spend actions to get rid of it, unlike frightened. There are very few feats and abilities that actually do give the sicken condition, so this is a big deal, especially since you get the effects of the runes that you're invoking as well. Okay, now we can talk about runes. Our most important runes are going to be the ones we can etch on creatures that do damage. Ronchu, Rune of Thunder, is a perfect example, but there's also the Fire one. And we also want any runes that we can put on our allies' weapons or unarmed attacks. Not so much the ones that use shields. Overall, we want our runes to do as much damage as possible, but some defensive runes could also help. Right now, we're only helping out our Necromancer and his Thralls, but we'll be able to help other builds out as well, which I'll talk about when we get to those builds. Because eventually this will be a party of 4. But as of recording this video, I've only done the Necromancer and this build. But when I get done with all 4 builds, there will be a compilation video, so you guys will be able to take all this together. Really quickly, for a free archetype, I recommend you either take the Fighter dedication, or the Archer, or the Eldritch Archer dedication for this build. This is a ranged Runesmith build, so Barbarian won't work very well. Otherwise, I would suggest that. Fighter has some great Archer feats for this build, so does Archer and Eldritch Archer. If you want some kind of magic, go with Eldritch Archer. Otherwise, Fighter or Archer will work well. Hello team players, and welcome to the last video of 2024. Today we're building a Tengu Ruffian Rogue. Let's dive in. So those of you that have seen my shorts know that we rolled completely randomly for this, and we got the Taloned Tengu. So we have a Talon's unarmed attack that deals 1d4 slashing damage. And of course, as a Tengu, we automatically get a Beak unarmed attack that deals 1d6 piercing damage. It might not seem like these attacks do very much, but remember that we're pretty much always going to have flanking thanks to our Necromancer's Thralls, which means sneak attack pretty much all the time, as both of these attacks do have the finesse trait, and we are a Ruffian Rogue, which means, yes, we do get a sneak attack with these weapons. And our Talons do have the Agile trait, which means that less of a multiple attack penalty, which is big for this build. Although these weapons are finesse weapons, we do want to focus on strength in this build, as the Necromancer's Thralls won't be able to give us flanking all the time. So we'll want to be making foes flat-footed to everyone with things like tripping and grappling. We'll also want charisma for this build, because we'll also be focusing a lot on deception and intimidation in this build, as those are other ways we can get the flat-footed condition, as well as lowering enemy stats. And we will need a little bit of dexterity in this build so we can wear medium armor. As our dexterity won't be great, that's why we're focusing on strength. I know that sounds weird for a Tengu, but that's how it goes. The main thing is we do want to have at least decent AC, and so we need a little bit of dex. For skills, athletics is going to be a big one, and so is intimidation and deception. We can have a little bit of diplomacy as well. We are a rogue after all, and we're going to have a lot of skills. We don't really need intelligence or wisdom for this build, so we're not going to be as good at recall knowledge as we could be. That doesn't mean that we can't have ranks in it. It just means we're not going to be as good at it as other classes. Alright, our first feat for this build is going to be You're Next. So if we reduce an enemy down to 0 hit points, we can, as a reaction, demoralize a foe within 60 feet, with a +2 bonus. Like I said, intimidation is going to be a big part of this build, and we're going to take down foes pretty easily because we have multiple ways of making foes flat-footed in this build. I mean, right now, all we really have is athletic actions and flanking with the Necromancer's thralls. But we're going to have more as we level up here. So getting sneak attack pretty much all the time is really going to help us knock foes down to 0 hit points, which means we get to use this a lot. For our ancestry feat at level 1, we're going to take Squawk. So if we critically fail a deception, diplomacy, or intimidation check against any creature that's not a Tengu, we can get a failure instead. Being able to just say, you know what, no, to a critical failure on 2 of our main skills is huge. I mean, yes, this ends up being a once per encounter thing, but especially on our feints, this is going to help a ton. As, yeah, rolling that nat 1 never feels good unless you have this feat. At level 2, of course, we're going to be taking Brutal Beating. We're a Ruffian Rogue, so we have access to this. So every time we critically hit a foe that's off guard, they're Frightened 1. Frightened is one of the best conditions in the game. It basically levels them down by 1, or whatever the number is attached to it. That means it's even easier for all party members to hit, as well as avoid anything they try to do. And of course, we are going to be taking a feat that is going to help us take advantage of that as well, which is of course Dread Striker. If a foe has a frightened condition, they're off guard to us. As like I said, intimidation is a big part of this build. Demoralize is going to be an action we should use on our third action pretty much all the time. And remember that Brutal Beating, they don't become immune for 10 minutes, unlike Demoralize. But rogues don't exactly have the best attack bonuses. But that's where other builds in this party come into play. And of course, the multiple ways we have of making foes off guard. For our level 5 ancestry feat, we're going to take Tengu Feather Fan. This essentially gives us a gust of wind spell once a day. This allows us to push enemies to where we want them to be to a certain extent. And we can't push them towards us, but we can push them pretty much everywhere else. Into hazards, or away from us if we're low on health. It also allows us to knock enemies prone in certain situations, which of course is another way we can get our sneak attack. And it's particularly effective against creatures that have a fly speed, as if those fail, they take the effects of the critical failure. And that means they take fall damage in addition to the 2d6 bludgeoning damage they take from being knocked prone. Of course, if they critically fail, then you're not going to be able to sneak attack them that turn because they're pushed back 30 feet. And this does take 2 actions. But they are prone, so they're easier to hit for everybody but you, essentially. It's probably better if they just regularly fail for you, but it's good for the team if they crit fail. Level 6 is when this build gets interesting because we'll be taking the Monk Dedication. Yes, this doesn't really give us a whole lot. I mean, it gives us trained in Monk class DC, and we're already trained in athletics, so we'll probably get acrobatics here. But we are taking this because we do need Monk feats for this build. Level 8 is when we get really good with our feints, because we'll be taking Stumbling Stance.
Believe it or not, Stumbling Stance is one of the few stances for Monk that does not require us to be unarmored. Not only does this give us a +1 bonus on our deception checks to feint, but it also gives us a 1d8 unarmed attack that has agile, backstabber, and finesse. They're the only strikes we can make in that stance, but they do allow us to add our sneak attack. And if any enemy hits us with a melee strike while we're in this stance, then they become off guard to the next strike we make against them before the end of our next turn. And then, of course, for our level 9 Ancestry feat, we're going to need Wind God's Fan. This gives us one more use of our Tengu Feather Fan and allows us to cast Wall of Wind in addition to Gust of Wind. One of the main things we want to do in this spell is trap enemies with our Necromancer's thralls, in addition to ourselves, which means having a wall of wind around enemies is a big deal. And it's a wall of wind, which means our Necromancer can summon his thralls on the other side of it, because he does have line of sight with that. And finally, for this video, at level 10, we're going to take Monk's Flurry. Unfortunately, Monk's Flurry has been nerfed, as you can only use it once per 1d4 rounds, but getting 2 sneak attacks for 1 action, even if it is only once every 1d4 rounds, is kind of a big deal. It is at regular multiple attack penalty, but that kind of action economy isn't something you can pass up, especially since we do have spells in this spell. I've talked about all the spells that this spell has access to, so let's talk about free archetype. Obviously, if you've got free archetype, then you'll want to take your monk or martial artist archetype on that side of free archetype. But if you're looking for something else, martial is an excellent choice for this belt, as you're going to be trained in all martial weapons. You won't use them, but you will be trained in them, and you'll obviously be trained in intimidation. And Dread Martial Stance is one of the best feats I've ever seen. But the archetype that I recommend the most for this build is definitely the Claw Dancer, because that archetype has insane action economy. You might not even need to take Monk's Flurry if you've got that particular archetype on your free archetype. We do have a Talon's attack because we are a Taloned Tengu, which means that archetype is 100% available to us.
Hello, team players! It's time for the 4th build in my Creature Trap party. But before that, I do want to give you guys a basic idea of the team strategy behind this Creature Trap party. We essentially want to lead our enemies into a trap. Essentially, we want our Necromancer to summon as many thralls as he can so that they're overwhelmed by the number of thralls. Our Runesmith will buff those thralls, and our rogue will use the thralls to get flanking, which means sneak attack. And this build will allow us to trap enemies in this situation, as well as do a bunch of damage to them at once. As for each build individually, our Necromancer will be able to cover our burst and our multi-target damage thanks to bombs and blowing up their thralls. It will also somewhat allow us to do single target DPR, because one of our thralls will be able to attack every round, assuming we make thralls every turn. Our Necromancer will also be able to cover different defenses, mostly AC and reflex saves when it comes to damage. And we'll be able to cover different damage types thanks to bombs. And of course, being an intelligence-based class means that we can focus on intelligence-based recall knowledge skills very effectively. And if we get enough thralls on the field, we can cover action economy manipulation as well. Mainly due to dead weight, but also if we get enough thralls around an enemy, they have to take out at least one enemy in order to even move at all. And finally, our Necromancer will cover our out-of-combat healing due to Elixirs of Life. As for our Runesmith, that will cover single target DPR with their bow, and any runes we make. And we'll be able to make runes for different types of elemental damage and change them, which covers our damage types for the entire party, really. They'll also be able to cover our buffs due to, again, runes on our weapons, and some debuffs. And finally, again, we will be able to cover our intelligence-based recall knowledge skills with this class as well, because again, intelligence-based.
Our rogue will definitely be able to cover single target DPR, as that's one of the main points of our rogue builds. Our rogue will also be able to cover one thing we haven't been able to cover, really, and that's will saves, as well as other saves at higher levels. Our rogue is also our debuffer and action economy and manipulation, because we will be doing things like stunning, tripping, and grappling. And finally, this belt. This belt will definitely cover our burst and our multi-target damage, as well as some single target DPR. The second thing they'll definitely cover is action economy manipulation, with spells like Slither and Wall of Flesh. We'll also be able to cover some different damage types, but mostly fire and cold damage. This is also where we'll get our burst healing with the Soothe spell. And of course, our charisma-based skills, as well as some buffs and debuffs. But the three most important things here are going to be our burst healing, our burst and multi-target damage, as well as our action economy manipulation. Those are going to be our main things we want to do with this belt. Of course, our ancestry is the chameleon gnome, which means that if we're in the right area, we can get +2 on stealth checks, which is going to help out with our action economy and manipulation. Since all of our spells don't require us to speak at all, this effectively means that enemies have to look for us in order to stop us from manipulating their action economy. Assuming, of course, that we roll a high on stealth. But that +2 is going to help. And you may have already figured this out, but we're going to be building a psychic today. And we're going to be going with the Oscillating Wave Conscious Mind, which will help us with our damage types and our damage. Specifically, our burst damage and our area damage. Although we won't really be able to do much area damage in this build because of our limited spell slots, as we do want to focus on the action economy manipulation as well. And for our subconscious mind, we rolled emotional acceptance, which does give us charisma as our main casting stat, which is why we can cover the charisma-based skills. We also get the Restore the Mind ability, which means whenever we unleash our psyche, we can do a little bit of burst healing and 2+ double our level, which doesn't sound like much, but it can really help. We can also buff our allies' defenses against mental effects, which of course does cover our buff side of this belt. As for ability modifiers, we don't really need strength at all for this build, as well as intelligence or wisdom, but we will need dexterity for our defense and constitution for our HP. And obviously we're going to need charisma for our spell attack rolls and DCs, which of course will help us with two of the main things we want to do with this build, which is burst and multi-target damage, and action economy and manipulation. For our first ancestry feat, we're going to go with First World Magic. This gives us a cantrip from the primal list, which basically means we can pick a cantrip that does different damage besides fire or cold damage. We won't be able to use our focus spells to amp it, but at least we'll have a cantrip that can do an extra type of damage. So something like Acid Splash would be effective here. For our first class feat, we're going to go with Warp Space. Not only does this allow us to have more range on our spells, it also means as long as we have line of sight and line of effect, we can basically ignore cover with our spells. And since we're focusing on burst and multi-target damage, that's kind of a big deal, especially for multi-target spells. Then of course at level 4, it's Violent Unleash. Not only does this give us an extra type of damage we can do, but it's also multi-target damage. Granted, we are stunned to 1 as we use this, but we can hit multiple targets that are near us, which we don't want people near us, so being able to hit them for 2d6 force damage, big deal. For our level 5 ancestry feat, we're going to go with Animal Occlusionist. Since we are charisma-based, being able to use charisma-based skills on animals is pretty nice. We might even be able to avoid combats with animals if we use this. Next at level 6, we're going to take Parallel Breakthrough for Telekinetic Rend. We won't really have a side cantrip that will hit multiple enemies until level 10. So we need this until we get to that point. This will essentially allow us to hit a bunch of enemies with a side cantrip instead of having to use a spell slot. After all, as a psychic, we're not going to have many leveled spell slots, and we want to save those for action economy manipulation anyway. So we need something, a psych cantrip, that can hit multiple enemies, even at this lower level. At level 8, we're going to take Whispering Steps. This effectively allows us to amp a cantrip to force an enemy to step in a direction of our choosing. So either towards a thrall, towards our rogue, or away from us. This won't provoke attack of opportunity because it is a step and it is forced movement. But this means we can force them to spend an action moving away or moving towards what they want to attack, which is action economy manipulation, because even a step takes an action. Obviously, you can't make them like step off a ledge or into hazardous terrain or whatever, but we can move them into an area, like say into the blast radius of our Necromancer's thralls, or into an area where our rogue can easily grapple them, or into a flanking position even. This is basically a once per day per enemy ability, but can be very, very helpful. For our level 9 ancestry feat, we're going with First World Adept. Invisibility is great for stealth, and I already talked about why stealth is good for this build, for our action economy and manipulation, and Revealing Light is going to help us if enemies try to go invisible on us. Since we want to overwhelm them with a bunch of thralls and a rogue, them becoming invisible is not a good thing. So, Revealing Light says, yeah, no more invisibility for you. And the last feat I'm going to cover in this video is Inertial Barrier. This one we're mostly going to want to use on ourselves to give us a little more resistance in situations where enemies are attacking us instead of our allies, since we don't have a champion or anything like that, because we won't really be targeting our allies with our spells. But having resistance against damage is good. Melee attackers are not something we want to have to deal with in this build, so giving us resistance to their damage is going to be important here, even though we do have pretty decent HP for a psychic. Now, for spells, you're mostly going to want to focus on the Soothe spell, Slither, and any wall spells you have access to that are on the occult list, like Wall of Force, Wall of Flesh, Prismatic Wall, Chromatic Wall, that sort of thing. Remember that one of the main things we want to do with this build is trap enemies in with our Necromancer's thralls and our rogue, and those wall spells are going to help us do that. And Slither is going to help when our rogue can't really grapple people. And of course, at the end of the day, we also want to do area damage to enemies. And in some situations, it's not really going to matter if we hit the Necromancer's thralls, because they'll just make more. We do have to be careful about hitting our rogue with those though. So where we put those area of effect spells are going to be important. But that Slither will help the rogue get more sneak attacks and debuff enemies, on top of action economy manipulation. So we definitely want that spell in our repertoire as soon as we can cast it, for sure. For your free archetype, pretty much any charisma-based caster will help you here. Sorcerer can give you more occult spells if you want them, and they can also give you spells from other lists, particularly Arcane or Divine. Bard can again give you more occult spells, but it can also really help with buffing. Although, if you're playing this with my Creature Trap party, then your Runesmith is going to help you with your buffing quite a bit. Summoner can give you a pet that can help protect you, and if you really want divine spells, you could go Oracle. But overall, any archetype that can give you spells that go off charisma is going to help a lot with the spells. And that's the builds. The compilation of all 4 of these builds will be up soon. And if you guys want a Google Sheet for this build all the way up to level 20, you can definitely join my Patreon page to get it. That, my Discord server, as well as my social media are all in the description below. But if you guys want a basic idea of teamwork roles in this system, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.